The marble floor of the courthouse hallway is cold against my hand as I brace myself. My knuckles are white. The air smells of stale coffee and fear, the kind that clings to worn carpet and legal documents. He stands 20 feet away, flanked by a shark of a lawyer, a smirk playing on his lips. His eyes meet mine, and the smirk widens, morphing into something cruel, something sharp and meant to cut deep. He doesn't need to speak. I know the words forming behind that look. I've heard them before, whispered in the sterile air of our former home, spat across the polished surface of negotiation tables. Homeless. The word is a physical blow, even when it's just in his eyes. It's a promise, a prediction delivered with absolute certainty. He believes it with every fiber of his being. And right now, in this echoing hallway, surrounded by the trappings of justice that feel anything but just, the weight of it threatens to buckle my knees. I clutch my worn handbag like a shield, the cheap materials suddenly feeling inadequate against the polished armor of his disdain. Every line of his tailored suit, every perfectly coiffed hair, screams victory, screams his absolute conviction that I am about to be erased, left with nothing but dust and regret. The hall is silent except for the distant murmur of voices from other courtrooms, other battles. But for me, the silence is deafening, amplifying the sound of my own heart hammering against my ribs. He takes a step closer, just one, and the smirk twists into a silent, guttural laugh that only I can hear. Homeless. It's a brand he intends to press into my skin, a mark of my failure, my perceived weakness. My breath catches in my throat. The cold marble isn't just under my hand, it's spreading through my chest. If you've ever felt like someone else held all the power, like they could simply erase you, tell me in the comments. I read all of them. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. We built the life that looked, from the outside, like a fortress. A solid, unshakable structure of shared meals, weekend routines, and plans stretching into a future we painted together with broad, hopeful strokes. His name is Richard. Mine is Sarah. For 15 years, we were Richard and Sarah. Not just two people, but a unit. We met in college, young and ambitious. He was loud, charismatic, full of big ideas. I was quieter, meticulous, the one who paid attention to the details, who saw the potential in the blueprint. He talked about building an empire, about changing the world of real estate. I listened, I supported, I believed. I wasn't just his wife. I was the quiet engine behind his flash. I managed our home, yes, but I also managed our finances, the practical side of his grand visions. He made the deals, closed the sales, shook the hands. I balanced the books, researched the markets, kept the foundations steady while he built upwards. He made good money, very good money. And I, in my quiet way, made sure it grew, ensuring a portion was set aside, invested wisely, shielded from the inevitable risks his flamboyant style sometimes courted. He saw me as the anchor, the sensible one. He didn't see the strategist. He didn't see the long game I was playing, not just for us but for the future, for security that transcended the fleeting highs of a big deal. Our home was a testament to his success, sprawling, modern, filled with expensive art and furniture that felt slightly too large for the space, as if anticipating more success, more things to fill the void. I filled it with smaller things, with warmth, with the scent of baking bread, with the comfort of knowing where everything was. My desires were simple then. A comfortable life, a partnership, a future where we could relax, maybe travel. I didn't crave the spotlight or the power suits. I found satisfaction in the quiet strength of stability, in the knowledge that I was contributing, building a different kind of wealth, the kind that wasn't just measured in dollars but in resilience, in foresight. I loved him, or I thought I did. The early years were good, filled with shared dreams and late-night talks. The shift was gradual, insidious. His success grew, and with it a certain arrogance. My quiet contributions became invisible. He started making all the decisions, dismissing my input with a wave of his hand. My financial management was seen as quaint, unnecessary now that he was the earner. My careful investments were small potatoes compared to his multi-million-dollar deals. The quiet engine became irrelevant to him. He was the train, roaring down the tracks, leaving everything else in his wake. He didn't need an anchor anymore. He thought he could fly. The disruption arrived not with a bang, but with a cold, calculated click of an email notification. It wasn't from him. It was from a lawyer. His lawyer. A formal notification of divorce proceedings. No conversation, no tearful admission, no attempt at repair. Just a clinical, impersonal document requesting the dissolution of our marriage. My world didn't just stop. It imploded silently, inward. I remember sitting at my small desk in the sunroom, the one place in that huge house that felt entirely mine, reading the sterile language that tore my life apart. The sun, moments before warm on my skin, felt suddenly harsh, mocking. The birds outside seemed too loud, their cheerful chirping a cruel contrast to the silence inside me. Richard was traveling, of course. Always traveling. He wasn't even in the state when he initiated the process. It was efficient, clinical, devoid of any human messiness. Which, looking back, was perfectly him. He outsourced the difficult conversations, the emotional wreckage. He outsourced the ending of our 15 years together. The first few weeks were a blur of numb activity. Finding a lawyer, wading through paperwork, the surreal experience of discussing the division of a life we had built together as if it were just a portfolio of assets and liabilities. My lawyer, a sharp, compassionate woman named Eleanor, guided me through the initial shock. She listened patiently as I stumbled through the story of our marriage, the love that faded, the partnership that fractured, the growing distance. She saw the quiet strength beneath my initial fear. She also saw the mountain we had to climb. Richard's legal team was aggressive, ruthless. They challenged everything. They questioned my contributions, dismissed my financial acumen, painted me as a dependent, someone who had merely coasted on his success. My early struggles were not just legal, they were existential. I had to find somewhere to live. The big house, my home for so long, was suddenly a battleground, filled with ghosts and painful memories. I couldn't afford to stay there, not on my own, not with the immediate financial constraints the divorce imposed. Finding a new place felt like admitting defeat, like accepting the downsizing of my entire existence. I ended up in a small, one-bedroom apartment in a complex on the other side of town. It was clean, functional, but it felt temporary, precarious. The contrast with the sprawling house was stark. The walls felt thin, the space claustrophobic after years of wide-open rooms. It smelled of other people's lives, of instant ramen and cheap laundry detergent, not the familiar scent of my own routines. Moving in felt like shedding a skin, but the new skin was thin and vulnerable. Richard reveled in this. He knew where I was living. It came up in legal documents, in settlement proposals. His lawyer would casually mention my modest new accommodations and Richard would add the flourish. He called me once, a surprise call during the early negotiations, ostensibly to discuss logistics, but I knew his real motive. His voice, smooth and dripping with false concern, was like acid. Heard you found a little place, Sarah.
Così, immagine?
Must be quite the change from the house. Don't worry, he'd purr, you'll adapt. You're resourceful, in your own way. Though, a dry chuckle, the market's tough out there. Rents are sky high. Wouldn't want you to end up homeless. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and laced with malice. It wasn't a question or a genuine concern. It was a taunt, a projection of his deepest wish for me.
He wanted me to fail.
He needed me to fail to validate his narrative that he was the sole architect of our success, and that without him, I was nothing. This wasn't just about dividing assets anymore. It was about breaking me. The legal battle escalated quickly. Richard wasn't just fighting for money, he was fighting to inflict maximum pain. He hid assets, created convoluted paper trails, used every legal maneuver possible to delay, obstruct, and financially drain me. Every discovery request was a mountain of irrelevant documents designed to bury us. Every negotiation session was a performance where he portrayed himself as the wronged party, the generous one offering scraps while I was the greedy, entitled ex-wife. His lawyers were masters of this theater. They painted my quiet investments as lucky accidents, my financial management as simple bookkeeping any child could do. They presented Richard's vast wealth as solely the product of his genius and hard work, completely erasing my 15 years of support, stability, and unseen labor. The rising challenges were relentless. My legal fees piled up. The small apartment felt less like a temporary refuge and more like a cage. Friends, caught in the middle, began to distance themselves. His version of events, amplified by his wealth and influence, started circulating through our former social circles. I was the bitter woman trying to take half of what she didn't earn. The loneliness was a physical ache. I would sit in my tiny living room at night, the city sounds drifting through the thin walls, and feel utterly adrift. The fear he spoke of, the fear of ending up with nothing, started to feel less like a distant threat and more like an approaching storm. Richard's mockery became a regular occurrence. He'd find ways to insert it into emails, through his lawyers, even in brief, unavoidable encounters at mediators' offices. Each time, the word homeless or variations of it, sleeping on a friend's couch, eating ramen in a dive, back where you started, were delivered with that same cruel smile, that same absolute certainty. He genuinely believed he had stripped me down to nothing, that my quiet nature meant I had no resilience, no fight. He saw my temporary apartment as my inevitable final destination before complete destitution. He measured success only in visible wealth, in the kind of power that could be flaunted. He couldn't see the internal fortitude, the quiet reserves I had built. He couldn't see that his cruelty, rather than crushing me, was forging something hard and unyielding inside. The midpoint shift arrived not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, cold realization that settled deep in my bones. I was sitting opposite him in a cramped mediation room, listening to his lawyer drone on about his financial genius, about my negligible contributions, about the generous settlement offer that would leave me with barely enough to cover a year's rent in my current, modest dwelling. Richard was watching me, that familiar smirk plastered on his face, waiting for me to flinch, to show weakness. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. It wasn't anger, not exactly.
It was colder than that.
It was the realization that his cruelty wasn't just a tactic, it was inherent. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to destroy my spirit. He didn't see me as a former partner, a person I had shared a life with. He saw me as an obstacle, a relic of a past he wanted to erase, a nobody who dared to ask for what was rightfully hers. His contempt was absolute, and that realization changed everything. Trying to appeal to fairness, to shared history, to any lingering sense of decency, was pointless. He had none left for me. The rules of engagement shifted. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a war. And in war, you don't fight with sentimentality. You fight with strategy, with cold, hard facts, with weapons your opponent doesn't even know you possess. I looked at his smug face, at his lawyer's condescending smile, and a quiet, steel-like resolve hardened within me. They thought they knew me. They thought they had me cornered, financially crippled, emotionally broken. They were wrong. Richard had always been so focused on the grand gestures, the public victories, the deals that made headlines. He never paid attention to the quiet accumulation, the long-term stability I had meticulously built, independent of his volatile empire. He never knew about the trust. Years before, after my grandmother passed away, she had left me a substantial sum. Not astronomical wealth, but a significant amount that I had, with her guidance and the help of a trusted advisor, placed in a private trust. It was structured for long-term growth, shielded, quiet. Richard knew my grandmother had left me something, but he always assumed it was a modest inheritance, enough for a rainy day, perhaps a down payment on a sensible car. He'd joked about it once, early in our marriage, calling it my secret squirrel fund, and promptly forgetting about it, dwarfed as it was by his burgeoning real estate deals. He never asked about it. He never needed to. He was the big earner, the provider. My small inheritance was irrelevant to his world. And I, seeing how quickly his ambition could outstrip his caution, how easily he leveraged everything, kept it quiet. I didn't hide it out of malice. I hid it out of a quiet instinct for self-preservation, a sense that some things needed to be kept separate, safe. It was my anchor, my true security, the one piece of my financial life that wasn't tied to his volatile career. Now, in that cramped mediation room, as he watched me with that predatory grin, the trust became more than just a financial safety net. It became a weapon. My strategy shifted from defense to offense. I stopped trying to minimize the damage and started looking for a way to turn the tables completely. I left that mediation session not defeated, but transformed. My lawyer, Eleanor, noticed the change immediately. My slumped shoulders were straighter. The fear in my eyes had been replaced by a cold, calculating light. I told her about the trust. I showed her the documents, explained its structure, its insulation. Eleanor, usually calm and collected, leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Sarah," she said, her voice low, "this changes everything." The deepening crisis, ironically, intensified after I had the plan. Because putting the plan into action required strategic waiting, enduring more of his attacks, letting him believe his tactics were working, letting him dig his own grave of smug certainty. The legal maneuvers continued. He squeezed harder, dragging out proceedings, increasing legal costs, making my life in the small apartment feel more and more like a temporary holding pen. His homeless comments became more frequent, more public. He'd make them to mutual acquaintances, knowing they'd get back to me. "Poor Sarah," I heard he'd said at a charity gala we used to attend together. "Lost without me. Probably doesn't even know how to keep a roof over her head anymore." Each comment was a jab, designed to erode my confidence, to make the fear he wanted me to feel a reality. And sometimes, late at night, in the silence of that small apartment, it did feel real. The mounting bills, the uncertainty of the future, the sheer exhaustion of the fight, it all pressed down on me. Was I crazy to think I could fight back? Was the trust enough? Was my quiet strength any match for his aggressive power? There were nights I lay awake, the city noises a lullaby of despair, and the word, homeless, echoed in my mind, no longer a taunt from him, but a whispered possibility from my own deepest fears. He had managed to plant that seed of doubt, and it was trying to bloom in the dark corners of my mind. This was the lowest point. Everything felt fragile. My resolve wavered. The isolation was crushing. He had successfully used the legal system, his wealth, and his cruel certainty to push me to the brink. He believed he had won the psychological war, that I was broken. But beneath the fear, the cold core of determination forged in that mediation room remained. Each cruel word, each legal obstacle, rather than breaking me, added another layer of steel to that core. He wanted me homeless? He wanted to erase me? I wouldn't just survive. I would thrive. And I would do it in a way that struck at the very heart of his arrogance, his carefully constructed world of visible success. The plan, quiet and complex, was already in motion. Eleanor and the advisor who managed my trust were working meticulously, leveraging resources Richard never knew existed. The target was identified, the strategy refined. While Richard was busy in court, fighting over furniture and bank accounts, believing he was grinding me into dust, I was building something in the shadows. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic moment, but the quiet, steady progress of the plan. It was the phone calls with Eleanor that shifted from defensive tactics to offensive strategy. It was the meetings with the trust advisor, discussing acquisitions and market timing instead of alimony and asset division. It was the feeling of agency returning, the sense that I was not just reacting to his moves, but orchestrating my own. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel. Every time I felt overwhelmed, every time his mocking words replayed in my mind, I focused on the plan. I pored over spreadsheets, signed documents, made decisions that felt impossibly large but necessary. The target of the plan was audacious, almost unbelievable. It wasn't just about securing my future. It was about dismantling his narrative of my incompetence, about using the very invisibility he had imposed on me to my advantage. He saw me as small, insignificant. He never looked closely enough to see the quiet power I held. He was so focused on the visible empire he had built that he was blind to the foundation I had quietly laid for myself, and now the new structure I was building on it. The resolve solidified. I wouldn't just walk away from the marriage with a settlement. I would walk away having proven him wrong in the most undeniable way possible. The goal was no longer just survival, it was vindication. It was a quiet, cold kind of justice. The day of the final hearing arrived like any other day, gray and overcast. But the air in the courthouse hallway crackled with unspoken tension. Richard was there, in his impeccably tailored suit, radiating confidence. His lawyer looked equally smug. I felt a strange calm, a stillness at the center of the storm that had raged for months. My lawyer, Eleanor, met my eyes, a flicker of steel in hers. We were ready. We sat at opposing tables. The judge, a stern woman with tired eyes, went through the initial formalities. Richard's lawyer presented his final arguments, rehashing his claims, emphasizing Richard's vast wealth, my supposed lack of contribution, the generous offer. He ended with a flourish, suggesting that with the proposed settlement, I might, just might, be able to afford modest, long-term housing, avoiding the unfortunate fate my client was concerned about. He didn't say the word homeless, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Richard smirked, looking directly at me, a silent, triumphant challenge in his eyes. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She stood slowly, adjusting her glasses. Her voice was calm, measured, utterly devoid of emotion. She addressed the court, outlining my contributions, my financial prudence over the years. She meticulously dismantled their claims, presenting evidence that countered their narrative point by point. Richard shifted in his seat, the smirk faltering slightly. This wasn't the tearful, defeated woman he expected. Then, she introduced the trust. She explained its origins, its separate structure, its substantial growth over 15 years. Richard's eyes widened fractionally. He leaned towards his lawyer, whispering furiously. His lawyer looked flustered. They clearly had not anticipated this. They had dismissed my grandmother's inheritance, never bothered to dig deeper. But that wasn't the twist. The existence of the trust was merely the setup. Eleanor paused, letting the weight of the information settle. The courtroom was silent. My heart hammered, a frantic bird in my chest. This was it. Your Honor, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a quiet power, my client, Sarah, has, through prudent management of her separate assets, not only secured her financial future, but has also made a significant investment in the local real estate market. Richard was watching her, his brow furrowed, his smugness replaced by confusion. An investment? What kind of investment could someone like me, according to him, possibly make? Eleanor turned slightly, looking directly at Richard. Specifically, Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and resonant. Acting through her private trust, Sarah recently acquired a controlling interest and, subsequently, full ownership of the apartment complex known as the Grandview Residences. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the small courtroom. The Grandview Residences. It wasn't the most expensive complex in the city, not one of Richard's gleaming towers, but it was well-known, stable, and significant. More importantly, Richard's face went pale, ash-white. His eyes, moments before filled with contempt, were now wide with shock, disbelief, and a dawning, horrifying realization. He lived at the Grandview. After we separated, he had moved out of the house and into a luxurious penthouse apartment there. He had chosen it, he told me years ago, because it was a solid, well-managed property. He owned a minor stake in the management company that ran it, a small, almost insignificant investment he'd made years ago and forgotten about, a footnote in his vast portfolio. He saw himself as a resident, a tenant, albeit a very important one, but also someone with a tiny, indirect connection to the building's operations. He felt secure there. He felt powerful there, a man of status residing in a building he was tangentially involved with. Eleanor's words hung in the air. Sarah, who he had promised would be homeless, now owned the very building he lived in. The acquisition was finalized last week, Eleanor stated calmly, producing the relevant documents. My client is now the legal owner of the Grandview residences, including all units within the complex. Richard stared at me across the tables. His jaw slackened. The color drained completely from his face. He started to tremble, subtly at first, then more visibly. His lawyer was frantically whispering to him, but Richard didn't seem to hear. His eyes were fixed on me, filled with a raw, unadulterated horror. As the new owner, Eleanor continued, her voice unwavering, Sarah has, of course, reviewed all existing tenancy agreements. Mr. Richard Sterling, she paused, letting his name hang there, is currently a tenant in Penthouse Unit 14B. His lease expires at the end of the month. The implication was clear. The man who had mocked me, who had predicted my homelessness, was about to receive a notice from his new landlord. From me. He wasn't just losing the divorce settlement battle. He was losing his home, his perceived status, the very ground beneath his feet. The weapon he had tried to use against me, the threat of homelessness, had been turned, magnified tenfold, and aimed squarely back at him. Richard made a sound, a strangled gasp that was closer to a choke. He clutched at his chest. His face contorted, not in anger, but in utter, total collapse. He didn't speak, didn't scream, didn't argue. He simply buckled. His eyes rolled back, and he slumped forward, hitting the table with a thud before sliding to the floor. The chaos erupted. Richard's lawyer shouted, rushing to his side. Bailiffs moved forward. Someone called for a medic. The courtroom, moments before silent and tense, was now a scene of frantic activity surrounding the man who, minutes ago, had been the picture of smug dominance. I sat still, watching the unfolding scene with a strange detachment. There was no triumph, no surge of vengeful glee, just a profound, heavy quiet. The man who had tried to break me, who had relentlessly predicted my ruin, was now lying collapsed on the floor, felled not by physical force, but by the sheer, unexpected weight of being proven utterly wrong. The homeless woman had just bought his building. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. The aftermath was a blur of hushed voices, paramedics, and legal discussions conducted in urgent whispers. Richard was taken away. The hearing was adjourned. I walked out of the courthouse into the cool, gray afternoon air. The city noise felt different now. Not a soundtrack of despair, but just sound. The collapse itself hadn't brought me joy. It was anticlimactic, messy. The true satisfaction came later, in the quiet moments. It came in signing the final documents, seeing my name, Sarah Sterling, as the owner of the Grandview residences. It came in walking through the lobby of the building, not as a temporary tenant, but as the proprietor. The air inside smelled different now, not of other people's lives, but of potential, of my own future. Owning the complex wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about securing my future in a way that was tangible, undeniable, built on the very foundation of quiet strength Richard had dismissed. It was proof that his narrative was false, that I was capable, resilient, resourceful. His cruelty had ironically forced me to leverage my hidden strength in a way I never would have otherwise. He thought he was making me homeless. He was actually making me a real estate owner, a landlord, a woman with significant assets and control over her own destiny. I didn't evict Richard immediately. His lease, as Eleanor pointed out, had a few weeks left. I sent him a formal letter, via the building management, which I now oversaw, detailing the change in ownership and the upcoming lease expiration. It was impersonal, professional, devoid of any mention of our history or his cruelty. It was simply business. The dry humor I had felt sometimes during the worst parts of the divorce resurfaced in the quiet moments after sending that letter. The man who wanted me sleeping on a friend's couch would now need to find his own new couch, somewhere else. The complex is a busy place. There are tenants to manage, maintenance issues, finances. It's work, demanding work. But it's my work. It's building something real, something that provides housing for people, something stable. It feels right. It feels like a foundation, not a temporary structure. I don't think about Richard much anymore. His collapse wasn't a triumphant moment etched in my memory. It was a sad, pathetic end to a relationship that had long been dying. The bitterness is fading, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of having navigated the storm and emerged stronger. I didn't just survive. I built something bigger than he ever thought I was capable of. I proved him wrong, not with words, but with deeds. And that, I've learned, is the most powerful kind of victory. The fear of homelessness is gone, replaced by the solid certainty of having many roofs over my head. The irony is a constant, quiet companion. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.